Welcome back to another sewing tutorial. My name is Miiraa and I am the person behind Miiraa.handmade, and today we're going to sew the Flora Wrap Skirt. It's a beautiful A-line skirt that wraps around your body, and it has some ties that you can use to tie it with on the side. And because it's a wrap skirt, it's slightly size adjustable, so it changes with your body, and I think that's just beautiful. Now in this tutorial, you're going to see me use an overlock machine. If you don't have one, don't worry, you can just use a zigzag stitch on your normal sewing machine. And you're also going to see me use an automatic buttonhole foot and an automatic buttonhole stitch. Again, if your sewing machine can't do that, don't worry, I will show you another way. So basically that means all you need is just a very basic sewing machine that can do a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. And there's nothing else, no zipper, nothing special. I think that makes it the perfect beginner sewing pattern. So even if you've never sewn anything before, I think you can make this pattern. I will show you everything step by step so you don't have to worry at all. And together we will be able to make a beautiful wrap skirt. As for fabric, I always like to make mine out of linen, but you can use different fabrics. So as long as it's non-stretch, so a woven kind of fabric, and as long as it's got a little bit of drape to it, you should be fine. You could, for example, use a cotton poplin or a cotton twill. You could probably also use wool. I haven't used that for this skirt in particular, but I've used it for similar skirts, so wool should work fine as well. I wouldn't use a stretch fabric just because the pattern isn't designed for that, but yeah, go for something non-stretch and it'll work beautifully. And with that being said, let's get sewing. Let's start by cutting out our pattern pieces, and because it's a wrap skirt, you have the back piece and that's going to be cut on fold, and then you have a wrap under panel and a wrap over panel, and these are both going to be cut just once. And then we're going to do a waistband facing, and the facing is for each pattern piece, and you're going to cut the back pattern facing on fold once, and the wrap over and the wrap under panel you're just going to cut once. But it's all written down on the pieces, so you're going to know exactly what to do. And we're going to start with our back piece, and as I said, that's going to be cut on fold. So the first thing we're going to do is fold our fabric. Then on the pattern pieces, you can see these little lines, and these are the hip notches, and they're going to help you later on to line up your pattern pieces perfectly. And what I like to do is I will just make a tiny little snip where the notch is, maybe like 1/2 centimeter, so it stays within the seam allowance, and that way later on I can line up the pattern pieces. I have now cut out all my pattern pieces, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have to sew the darts on the back panel, and I'm going to show you how. So these triangles here, these are our darts, and you're just going to have to see which one is yours. Since I'm sewing a size M, this one here is my dart, and this is the pointy end of my dart. So what I like to do to mark the dart is I will stick a pin in here, and this will mark the dart for now. And then we're gonna take out all the pins. And now I can't just take off the pattern, because then I would also take off the pin that marks my dart. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a second pin, and I will flip the pattern with the fabric, and now I can see where it comes through, and I will just put a second pin exactly through the same spot, flip it again, and then I can take this one out, and I can take the pattern piece off. But now we have 2 darts that we need to mark, so again I'm going to take another pin and I will push it through one more time. And now I have the dart marked on both sides, and now what you can do is very carefully pull the 2 sides apart and just make sure that the pins stay in. And then I personally just like to secure them. Now, what I forgot to do, and don't forget when you do it, is when you have the pattern on, and I will now just fold it exactly the way I had it. So when you have the pattern piece on, that seems about right. Just snip the legs of your dart, just the pieces up here. And since I'm sewing size M, this is one leg of my dart, and I'm just gonna make a tiny little cut, maybe like 1/2 centimeter, so it stays within the seam allowance. And then we're going to take it off. And now that way you have the pointy end of your dart marked and you have the 2 dart legs marked. And now the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to sew the darts. And for that, you have the end of your dart marked here, and then you just fold the 2 little cuts on top of one another, and you fold it like this. And then you just want to sew a straight line from the cut to down here. I have sewn about 500,000 darts by now, so I'm pretty good at just eyeballing it. But if you're new or you just want to make sure that it's 100% perfect, what you can do is just take a ruler and just draw a line that you can then follow, but that's up to you. We're now going to sew the darts, and I start up here and I sew down here. And one thing I want to say is I have linen fabric and both sides are identical, so it doesn't really matter for me. But if you have a fabric with a right and a left side, like for example, if you have a print or something on that, or you just have a side that looks better than the other, you want to make sure that at this point you have the left side, like the bad side, sticking up. So then the dart is sewn on the left side. And now what you saw me do is I have sewn the straight line, and then I actually sewed until I sewed over the fabric, so the last stitch isn't on the fabric anymore. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave some threads here. And now I'm not going to like backstitch or anything, but instead I'm just going to make 3 knots, because that makes the whole thing look a lot better. And then once I've made my knots, I'm going to cut off the thread, but I make sure to leave about 1 centimeter of thread hanging off. And then I'm going to sew the second dart. And make sure to backstitch at the beginning to secure your thread. Now we have to iron our darts, and I like to iron the darts towards the center, so I'm going to go like this. And then I'm going to flip it, and I'm just going to iron the top and make sure it looks perfectly neat. So that's what your back panel is going to look like, and on this side you can see the darts, and from the outside you basically can't see anything. There's just a stitch line that maybe you can see, but only if you pay attention. In our next step we're going to have to do quite some overlocking, And what we have to overlock is all the side seams. So we're going to start with, here we have the back panel. Let me just make sure you can see it all on camera. Yeah. So here we have the back panel, and you're going to overlock this side here and this side here. And then for the two front panels, you're going to have to overlock this side here and this one here and here and here. If you don't have an overlock machine, don't worry, you can just use a zigzag stitch. So now our next step is to sew together the back panel with our wrap on the panel. So what we're going to want to do for that is we have a back panel and we have the right side facing us, so the good side. You can see that the good side is facing you when you have the darts just like this, whereas on the bad side, the left side, you have this little flap. And then we're going to take the wrap on the panel, and for me, as I said, I have two identical sides, but if you have a good or a bad side, a left and a right side, you want to make sure that the right side of the over panel is facing the right side of the under panel. And then we're just going to pin them together, and you have these little notches here. Now that we've overlocked the sides, it's not that easy to see, but if you just look for them, you will see them, and then you're just going to have to make sure that the notches are lined up. And then we're going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance along this line here. As always, front and back stitch at the beginning and the end. And then before we're going to iron open the seam that we've just sewn, we're first going to sew on the wrap over panel. And I'm just doing that so I don't have to walk to my iron twice, because then I can iron open both seams in one go. Again, we have the right side facing us, and we're going to have the right side of the wrap over panel, and we're going to put them together and pin and then sew. And as before, we're just going to use the notches on the hips to make sure everything's lined up perfectly. And then we're going to sew that line with a 1 centimeter seam allowance as well. And as always, we're going to front and back stitch at the beginning and the end. So now that we've sewn the sides together, we're just going to press open the seams that we've just sewn. And I always like to make sure that the seams look good from the outside as well, so I usually give them a press from that side too. Now what we're going to do is just overlock all the way along the bottom seam. In the next step, we're going to have to sew the straps, and there's so many different ways that you can do them. I'm going to show you two. For one way, you need a bias tape maker, and if you don't have one, I'm going to show you how you can make your bias tape without one. So I'm first going to show you how to do it without the bias tape maker. And basically what you want to do is you're just going to fold your strap in half lengthwise, and you're going to iron that so that you can see it crease. And then once you have that, you're going to take one edge and you're going to fold that in until it hits the middle, and you're going to do that for the whole length. And then you're going to take the other side and you're going to do the exact same thing. So now it kind of looks like this, and now all that's left to do is just fold it in the middle again, and you should still have that crease from before. And there you go. Now what you can do is just sew along here. Now the second way I like to make my bias tape is with the bias tape maker, and then you have this little thing here, and you have a triangle at the top. I just cut that triangle here, and then you're going to take this wide part of your bias tape maker and you're going to feed through the fabric, and if you're lucky it'll just come out the other way here. If it doesn't, don't worry. What you can do is just going to feed it through until it doesn't move any further, and then you have this little slit here, and I just like to take a needle and just through that slit just push the fabric through until it comes out the other end, like here. And then you can just pull on it. I just like to pull until there's a few centimeters out already. And then you're going to take your iron and you have it at the narrow part, and no, it's not enough. You can pull some more. Now you just have the iron like this and you keep pulling. And then once you've done that, you can just fold it in half and then iron that. And these are the two ways you can make bias tape straps. Now, as to when to use which way, if it's just a short strap like this, I usually like to use the first way without a bias tape maker because it's pretty quick. But if it's a longer strap, I like to use a bias tape maker because then for me it's worth the setup, just because then I can just pull it along and iron and I have perfect straps. Now you have to cut off this little tip here where you make the triangle. And then I'm going to show you how you can finish both front parts of your strap so they look absolutely perfect. So to finish the front of your bias tape strap, what you want to do is you have it folded the way you're going to sew it now, but now you're going to fold it up like this, and then you're going to fold it that way, and now it's just folded the wrong way around. And now you're going to take one of these little flaps here and you're going to fold it over like this, and then you're going to sew along here. And now that you've done that, you can cut off all the excess thread, and then you can also cut off that top part here just a bit closer to the seam line. I like to sometimes use my scissors just to turn the corners out. Or sometimes, because sometimes scissors can be a bit dangerous. You can make holes in your fabric. I will use this part from my sewing machine, and I will just make sure the corners are perfect. And now that you're happy with it, you can just fold it back the way it was and then just sew along here the whole way. Just along here. And try to sew relatively close to the edge. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for the other strap, and just in case it was a bit too quick before, I'm going to show you again how you can finish the top part. So you have your bias tape like this, and then you're going to fold it up, and you're going to fold it over like this, and then you take the small flap here and you're going to bring it all the way over, and now you can sew along here a straight line. You're going to cut off that top part and fold the corners out. And then you're going to finish the rest of the bias tape like normal. Next, we're going to sew together a waistband facing, and what I usually like to do is I like to take the skirt that we've just sewn, and then I like to lay it flat, and that way you can see exactly how you have to sew together the pieces. So here in the middle we have the middle facing, and then on this side we have the wrap under facing, and on this side we have the wrap over facing. And then we're going to sew them together right sides facing. And then we're going to sew both sides with 1 centimeter seam allowance. As always, front and back stitch at the beginning and the end. Then we're going to overlock what we've just sewn just to finish the seams. So now that we've sewn together the waistband, what we're going to do next is we're going to overlock from here, and then this whole line here and up here. You don't have to overlock the top part. The next step is to attach the waistband facing to the skirt, and for that we're going to have the skirt right side facing us, and then we're going to take the facing, and the facing and the skirt need to be right sides facing. And then what I like to do is that first I like to just line up both side seams, because we have side seams here on the facing and we have the side seams on the skirt. And these are usually the very first points I like to just pin, and then after that I just go from there and pin the rest. And now we're going to sew all of this with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. So now we're just going to sew with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, and don't forget to front and back stitch at the beginning and the end. Next, I'm just going to press open the seams of the waistband. And then we're going to overlock the whole thing. So now that we've overlocked the waistband, there's an extra step that you can take, and in my opinion it makes such a huge difference, and that is that we're going to understitch the waistband. What that means is that we are simply going to just have the whole thing like this, and then we are going to sew this seam allowance part here onto the waistband. And that will help the seam lie really flat and just look so much better from the outside. So for understitching, I like to choose a longer stitch length. So I'm going to go with a 3.5. And then we're just going to put the fabric like this. And I personally wouldn't start right at the beginning. I would start a few centimeters in. And then you're just going to lay the seam onto the waistband. That's very important. Don't lay it onto the skirt because then you're going to see the seam from the outside. However, if you do it like this, it'll be invisible. And then I always like to just pull it apart a little bit. Front and back stitch, and then just sew the whole way. Now, if you look at it from the outside, you can't see the understitching, and it'll help the seam lie really flat. From the inside, it looks like this. So now we have understitched the waistband facing, and you can see the stitch here, but when you turn it outside, you can't see anything, and it just looks really crisp and clean. But now we have to attach the straps. So we're going to turn it right sides facing us. And then you want to make sure that you have the short strap on the side of the wrap over panel, and you're just going to put it here right below the seam like this, and you're going to fold down the seam, and then you want to pin that in place. And then you're going to do the same thing with the long strap on the side of the wrap on the panel. And always make sure that you have the unfinished side looking this way, and the finished side of the strap is just here hanging off. And then we're just going to sew both sides with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. And just make sure you set your machine back to the original stitch length. And now I've sewn over my strap, and what I like to do is just go back and forth a few times just to make sure that it's really secure. And then I'm going to do the same for the other side. So now that you've sewn in your straps, I would take my scissors and I would just cut the corner here a little bit, just so that it looks nicer when it's turned out. And then cut the corner on the other side as well. And then you can turn the waistband right sides out. And that's what it looks like. So the skirt is now almost done. All that's left to do is to hem the skirt, and then we will have to sew a little hole so we can thread the straps through. So to hem the whole skirt, we don't have to do a double fold because everything's overlocked. So we can just do a single fold. And starting from the waistband facing, it kind of tells you how much to fold in. As you can see, because that's already folded over, you can just continue that width. And then you're going to fold it all the way down. But here we have two perpendicular corners, and you could technically just hem it like this and then fold that up. But then you can see it doesn't look very good. We don't want that. So there's a nicer way to do it. So what I want you to do is just quickly fold it down the way it's going to be. And then down here, finger press. And then you can already see the crease. And then you're going to do the same on the bottom edge. Just fold it up however much you want it to be folded up, and then finger press that as well. And now you should see a little square here. Now, this is the left side. So now we take this little square and we fold it. And then you have that triangle here. And here you can still see the little crease from before. And now you just fold that triangle back from up here where the crease ends. You fold it back and you're gonna sew just right next to this little triangle. You're not gonna sew on it. You don't want to catch it with your thread. You're gonna sew next to it. So here you have the triangle and you're gonna sew next to it. So one more time, this is the left side that's facing us. And here you can see that little square that we made by finger folding or finger pressing. And now you're just gonna take that and you fold this little triangle here just by lining up the seams like this. And now you have this triangle, and you can see that's the crease from before. And now you want to fold it. Here's the crease. You want to fold that triangle back so that you start folding from where the crease ends. And now you're going to sew here, but you're not going to catch the triangle. And then you're going to do the exact same thing for the other side. So I'm going to show you one more time. We have the left side facing us. You can see the square. We fold the triangle. And here's the line from the crease. We fold the triangle like that. And we're just going to sew this line. And now you can cut off the triangle or just trim it down to the seam allowance. Do that on both sides. And then you can turn your corners out. And now you can see you have perfect corners. And now what you can do is you can go to your iron and you can iron this flat here. And then you can sew it. And then do the same thing for the whole bottom edge. And do it for this side here as well. And then you have hemmed your whole skirt. If you want to, you can pin this in place, but you don't have to. It's just if it makes you feel more secure. And then once you've done that, you've pressed everything, you can start sewing with one long stitch going from here, then pivoting here, going all the way along the bottom seam, pivoting here again, and then going up. I'm not going to start sewing right from the top here, but I'm going to make sure that I do catch this part here. So I'm going to start sewing just before the end of the waistband. And you can see I pinned it here just because I wanted to make sure that the seam really aligns with that one up here when I fold it up. And then one more thing I like to do just to have your waistband secured is you can either just sew it down like this. You can just run a stitch along here and that'll have it secured. But if you don't want that, if you want it to look like there's absolutely nothing from the outside, like this, then you can stitch in the ditch. And then you're just going to go to all the lines here. And you're going to make sure that you sew on the line, because then your stitches will be invisible. And that's what I'm going to do. So make sure you have the outside. And then I use my hand wheel to turn the needle down and really align it with the seam line. Now it's perfect. And now I'm just going to sew very, very slowly. And with every stitch, I make sure I stay within the seam line. And now you can see the stitch is almost invisible. You can see it a little bit just because I used a pretty contrasting color, but if your thread matches your fabric a bit better, it'll be completely invisible. Now we are almost done. We have just one last step to do, and that's creating a hole where we can thread the strap through so that we can wrap the skirt around. And I like to use a buttonhole for that, but if you don't have an automatic buttonhole foot or stitch, I will show you a way that you can do it without that. But basically what you have to do is you have to find your wrap over panel. It's the longer one, it's this one for me. And then here's the side seam. And then you want to place the stitch a little bit behind the side seam. The reason you don't want it on your side seam is because there's already quite a bit going on. You have a lot of different layers of fabric that meet each other there. So I like to place it just a little bit behind it because that way it's just going to be a little bit smoother. So I'm going to show you how it works with the buttonhole foot for my sewing machine, but every machine's different, so I would just check you use a manual. So the first thing we're going to have to do is I'm going to take off my normal presser foot, and then I have a buttonhole foot like this. And back here I have a button, and that's just a button that I use when I want to make holes for straps. But the hole is going to be the size of that button. And then I'm going to put the foot in. And then what's very important for me, and I have experimented quite a bit with my buttonhole foot, and at first it never worked, and that's because there's a little thing back here, like a little lever, and you have to pull that down. And if you don't do that, it doesn't work, at least for my machine. And then you can basically just start sewing. But in either case, I would really highly recommend that you test out the buttonhole on a scrap piece of fabric first. Oh, and of course you have to choose a buttonhole stitch if you have one. So for me, it's that stitch here. So now that you've sewn your buttonhole here, there's only one thing left to do, and that's to open up the buttonhole, because right now it's just sewn on, but it's still closed, so you can't thread anything through. So what you're going to do is you're going to put a pin in at the front of your buttonhole, and that's just a safety feature, because then you're going to take a seam ripper. And with that seam ripper, you're basically just gonna rip through the buttonhole. And if you didn't have that pin here, it could happen that you're just gonna rip through and then the buttonhole's destroyed and you can't really fix it anymore. But because you have that pin here, it's gonna stop you from going all the way through. So I'm always a bit paranoid, so I like to make sure that it's really within the buttonhole and not somewhere up here. And then you're just gonna push through and then just gonna rip along here. And now the pin has stopped me. And when I check, it has worked perfectly. And I have opened up my buttonhole. And now I can test it. I can take this strap and I can see if I can thread it through. It's still a bit difficult, but it works. And yeah, that's it. You have now finished your wrap skirt, so go put it on and see what it looks like. So as promised, I'm going to show you an alternative way of how you can sew your buttonholes when you don't have a buttonhole stitch or a buttonhole foot. What you're going to need is just a tape measure and something to mark your fabric with. And then my straps are about 1 centimeter wide, so I'm gonna make the hole a bit wider than that just so I can fit through easily. So I'm gonna measure a bit more than 1 centimeter and I'm just gonna mark that on the fabric. And then I'm gonna make a rectangle around it. Doesn't have to be that precise, don't worry about right angles. The rectangle on either side should be a few millimeters, something like this. And then I'm going to show you what to do on the sewing machine. On your sewing machine, choose a zigzag stitch and then lower your stitch length. I'm going to do something like probably 0.3 and lower your width as well. I'm going to do 2. And then here I have my rectangle and I'm just going to sew all the way around it. I'm not going to sew the middle line. That's what we're going to cut open later on. Now here you have the rectangle. We've just sewn around it once and obviously that's a bit big compared to the buttonhole that I've shown you before, but I just wanted to make sure it's visible. But yeah, you're gonna have to make yours smaller most likely, unless you have really big straps. But then you're just gonna proceed the way we did with the buttonhole. So that means you're gonna take a pin and you're gonna pin it like this so that the top edge of your buttonhole is safe. And then you can take your seam ripper and you can just rip all the way until you're stopped by the pin, and then you can take it out and here's your buttonhole. And that's it for today's sewing video. I hope you had fun making your Flora Wrap Skirt, and if you take any pictures, please make sure to tag me in them. I always love seeing your creations. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thank you so much for sewing with me and I'll see you next time.